Every grand project has two faces, the one it shows to the world and the one it shows its own citizens. Saudi Arabia, with Vision 2030 and NEOM, is no exception. What looks like a shining showcase of modernity to the world can feel, for Saudis, like a daily burden, or like a promise still waiting to be fulfilled. The next episode of our story about Saudi Arabia and NEOM takes us into that space in between image and reality. We'll look at how the country presents itself to others, and how it looks into the mirror of its own identity. This is an episode about narratives, about propaganda, and about the real stories that unfold far away from the cameras. Imagine a billboard in central Riyadh. Against the backdrop of the desert, you see NEOM's futuristic skyline. The slogan reads, "A future without limits." A few hundred meters away stands an old neighborhood where young people are still waiting for housing, and older residents reminisce about times when life felt simpler. The contrast is striking. One city, two worlds, one vision, and many doubts. This episode will be a journey through those mirrors. We'll see how Saudi Arabia speaks about itself to the world, in the language of big numbers, sustainability, and strategic partnerships. And then we'll examine how citizens see that same story. Sometimes with pride, sometimes with reservation, sometimes with a quiet whisper. This is not our everyday life. It is also an episode about illusions, about how a country learns to balance between dream and reality. Because if Vision 2030 is a story about the future, we have to ask, who is writing that story, and who is merely an extra in the background? The introduction to this episode is an invitation to analyze not only facts, but also images, symbols, and emotions. Because Saudi Arabia's future is not just about numbers and investments. It is also about the stories the country tells itself and the entire world. Saudi Arabia as a global leader. Picture this. On a stage in Riyadh, the lights flash, cameras beam the image to millions of viewers. Mohammed bin Salman stands beside a giant screen showing the vision of NEOM, a city of the future, green energy, smart technologies, zero emissions. In the background, you hear the vocabulary repeated at every conference: innovation, diversification, global leader. Saudi Arabia no longer wants to be just an oil state. It wants to be a brand, a symbol, a story that captivates the world. The official narrative is coherent, carefully polished, repeated in every possible setting. NEOM is the city that is meant to prove that Saudi Arabia can get ahead of the West rather than simply copy it. Vision 2030 is the plan meant to show that an absolute monarchy can be modern and progressive, and Mohammed bin Salman is the leader meant to embody youth, energy, and the future. But this narrative is not only a story for the world. It is also a message aimed at the country's own citizens. Billboards in Riyadh, TV spots, articles in state media, all repeat one idea. We are on the path to greatness. We are part of a global future. Citizens are meant to believe they are taking part in something bigger than their own daily routines, that each step they take, even ordinary work or study, fits into a national vision. At the same time, this narrative is a political tool. It is a way to cover over harder topics, inequality, repression, restrictions on freedom, with a story about a glorious future. It is a mechanism that gives people a sense of pride, even if they don't yet feel change inside their homes. Look how the world talks about us, the media say. Look, we are not who we used to be. The problem is that the world doesn't always see the same thing. While Saudi Arabia showcases its futuristic projects, foreign media bring back the Khashoggi case, restrictions on women's rights, and crackdowns on dissent. The official narrative is constantly being questioned, and that is its paradox. The more the country tries to prove it is modern, the more visible the cracks that contradict the story become. Abdul Rahman and his friends watch the conference on TV. It looks incredible, one of them says. But is this really our future, or just a show for the world? Aisha adds, maybe both. Maybe we are part of this spectacle, even if we don't feel it yet. The official narrative works like a mirror that shows Saudi Arabia a prettier image than its everyday reality. But a mirror doesn't always tell the truth. And it is precisely in this gap between story and reality that Vision 2030 faces its greatest challenge. Because if the world decides it's just marketing and citizens feel it's just propaganda, the entire vision will lose its power. The official narrative can become the beginning of a new identity, or just another piece of stage scenery that the desert wind will eventually bury. The everyday narrative? Billboards in Riyadh glow in bright colors. They show happy families walking through NEOM's futuristic parks, smiling students in laboratories, women driving sleek electric cars. The slogans sound like promises. A future without limits. Arabia of modernity. Together, we create tomorrow. But everyday life unfolding behind those billboards looks different. In a small neighborhood on the outskirts of the capital, Abdul Rahman walks to the shop for groceries. In the queue, he hears older men talking, not about innovation, but about the price of meat and about how the electricity bill has gone up again. For them, Vision 2030 is a distant story, while their lives are measured not in billions of dollars, but in a daily household budget. Aisha meets her friends at university. They talk about the future. One dreams of working in a tech company, another is thinking of a quick marriage because that's a safer path. When the conversation turns to NEOM, there's a burst of ironic laughter. That city will be for foreigners and the rich. We'll stay here in Riyadh. Those words reveal how deep the gap can be between the state's narrative and the narrative of ordinary people. The everyday narrative is the language of skepticism, half smiles, sometimes pride, sometimes a quiet disbelief. People see changes, cinemas, concerts, new jobs, but they also know not everyone has access to them. They see open doors, but also the barriers: high cost of living, language requirements, dependence on state decisions. The state tells a story of global power, while citizens tell a story of their own everyday struggles. These two stories sometimes meet, but more often they pass each other without contact. It is as if two versions of Saudi Arabia exist in parallel, one on conference stages and in the media, the other in homes and on streets. You see this especially clearly in the provinces. There, modernization still arrives slowly, like an echo from Riyadh. In small towns, reforms look like tales from another world, as if NEOM were being built on another planet. People watch the commercials, then go back to homes where not much has changed. And yet the everyday narrative is not only a story of disappointment, there is also a note of hope in it. Abdul Rahman tells his friends, "Maybe we don't feel it yet, but our children will live differently. Maybe this is just the beginning." Aisha adds, "There was a time when billboards were nothing but propaganda. Today, at least some of it becomes reality." The everyday narrative is a mirror that shows not only the gaps, but also the process. Because even if people laugh at the vision, they are slowly beginning to think that something is changing. It's a process that is slow, full of doubts, but real. And it is precisely in this discrepancy between billboards and daily life that the real drama of Vision 2030 is playing out. Because if the state's story fails to translate into people's lives, the entire vision will turn into an empty commercial. But if even part of the dream seeps into everyday experience, then the state's narrative and the citizens' narrative may eventually meet at one point. How does the world see Saudi Arabia? The world now watches Saudi Arabia with a level of attention the kingdom had never known before. Once, its image could be summed up in a few words: oil, Mecca, conservatism. Today, foreign media write about NEOM, concerts in Riyadh, and women behind the wheel. Saudi Arabia wants to be seen as a leader of modernity. But the global narrative is rarely as gentle as the palace would like. In the West, Mohammed bin Salman's vision inspires both fascination and mistrust. Fascination, because Saudi billions open doors in Hollywood, sports, and technology. The kingdom buys football clubs, hosts boxing galas and Formula One races, invests in Silicon Valley startups. Media portray this as a spectacular U-turn. A desert country suddenly becomes a player in global culture. But the questions keep coming back. Is this a genuine transformation, or just sports washing and greenwashing? Image laundering paid for with oil money? Will the city of the future, NEOM, really be completed, or remain a futuristic model? Have women truly gained rights, or only as much as fits the narrative of a reformer? Imagine a foreign journalist coming to Riyadh for the Future Investment Initiative conference. He's seen the promotional clips, glass towers, modern campuses, smiling young professionals. Now, he walks through the city. Downtown truly dazzles with billboards and luxury cars, but on the outskirts he sees poorer districts, where daily life looks far less modern. He writes in his notebook, "Saudi Arabia is a country of two speeds, a future on display and a present in the shadows." The global narrative is torn. Economic outlets like Financial Times or Bloomberg write about enormous business opportunities. Opinion outlets remind readers of Jamal Khashoggi, of repression of the opposition, of limited freedom of speech. Aisha, reading foreign articles online, says to her brother, "The world doesn't understand us. It sees only the contrasts, not the process." Abdul Rahman replies, "Maybe that's true, but in politics, image is often more important than process. The global narrative does not depend solely on Saudi Arabia. It is shaped by others' interests as well. For the U.S., Saudi Arabia is a strategic partner and a key market. For Europe, a source of energy and capital. For China, a crucial link in the new Silk Road. Each country interprets Vision 2030 through its own lens. The boundary of global narrative is ruthless, because the world remembers and judges. Saudi Arabia can buy attention, but it cannot always buy trust. And that's why the image of NEOM and of the entire kingdom hovers between admiration and skepticism, between fascination and criticism. Because in the eyes of the world, Saudi Arabia today is no longer just desert and oil. It is a laboratory of the future, where no one yet knows whether the experiment will succeed or end in disaster. What no one talks about. Out loud. Every society has its untold stories. In Saudi Arabia, that silence is especially dense. Vision 2030 showcases great visions, concerts, women in cars, and futuristic cities. But alongside this official narrative, there is another, one you don't see in glossy brochures or on conference stages. It is the narrative of silence. In cafes, Abdul Rahman and his friends talk about work, technology, plans for the future. But when the conversation shifts to politics, silence falls. "Let's not talk about this here," someone whispers. Everyone knows there are boundaries in conversation that must not be crossed. Fear isn't all-consuming, but it's like a shadow. It appears whenever you approach a forbidden topic. Aisha, who dreams of working in NEOM, hears a warning from her friends. "Write about anything you like, but don't comment on politics online. You can talk about movies, fashion, education, but not about power." It's an unwritten rule that governs life both online and offline. The narrative of silence also includes those who don't fit the official image. Workers from Bangladesh, India, or Sudan who build NEOM's foundations rarely appear in adverts. Their daily reality is heat, hard labor, and crowded dormitories. They too are part of Vision 2030, but their voices are not heard. This is a kind of social censorship, not always imposed from above, often internalized. People know what can be said, and what is better, left unspoken. They know that dreams are acceptable, but criticism is risky. So alongside the official story of the future, there is a vast zone of silence. This silence has many faces. Sometimes it is fear, of the state, of family, of society. Sometimes it is loyalty. We don't speak because we want to protect the community. Sometimes it is simple resignation. It's always been this way, it will stay this way. But the narrative of silence is not dead. It lives in glances, in half-phrases, in jokes. Abdul Rahman says to a friend, "Look, they're talking about NEOM on TV again." His friend answers with a grin, "Sure, just don't ask how much it really costs." Laughter hides skepticism, and skepticism hides questions no one will ask aloud. In this silence lies the greatest risk to Vision 2030. Because if the official story drifts too far from people's experiences, if billboards and conferences never meet everyday life, the narrative of silence will become the dominant one. People will remain outwardly quiet, but inside they will know this is not their story. And then even the most beautiful vision may lose, not to politics, not to economics, but to silence that says more than 1,000 words. Parallel narratives: youth, women, the provinces. Saudi Arabia is not a uniform country, it is a mosaic in which every social group tells its own version of the future. In official communication, Vision 2030 and NEOM are a single, coherent narrative. In reality, dozens of stories coexist, sometimes parallel, sometimes conflicting. The narrative of the young, Abdulrahman and his peers see the future as an opportunity. For them, NEOM is not just a city, it is a symbol of possibilities that never existed before. Startups, technology, new forms of work, that's their language. But beneath the enthusiasm lies doubt. Is this really for us, or only for those with money and connections? Young people are split. They believe in change, but they know they must fight for their place so as not to remain spectators at a show reserved for the elite. The narrative of women? Aisha and her friends tell a different story. For them, Vision 2030 is a breakthrough, doors opening that were locked for decades. Driving licenses, education, the possibility to work, these are concrete changes touching daily life. But alongside this runs the voice of mothers and grandmothers who repeat, "This is temporary, this is risky, this is not our place." Women in Saudi Arabia live in a double narrative, one that promises freedom and one that reminds them of traditional roles. The narrative of the provinces? In the provinces, the story looks different again. There, neon billboards are like images from another world. In small towns, modernization is still distant. Cinemas, concerts, and new investments are topics from television, not from everyday life. For many provincial residents, Vision 2030 is an abstraction. Their lives revolve around the local community, family, and mosque. Their narrative sounds like this: "This is not our Arabia. This is TV Arabia." When narratives collide, these three narratives, of youth, of women, and of the provinces, exist side by side but rarely meet. In Riyadh, young people talk about global markets, while in the provinces the talk is about food prices and family honor. Women in big cities fight for a place in business. In the South, many girls still finish education at basic levels. This stratification means Vision 2030 can be a source of pride and frustration at the same time. Europeans would call it parallel modernities, a situation where one society lives in several eras at once. Part of Saudi Arabia is already thinking about the year 2050, another part is still stuck in the reality of the 1970s. Parallel narratives are dangerous and inspiring at once. Dangerous because they may divide the country into elites and the rest. Inspiring because they show that change does not have to look the same everywhere. It can have many shades and speeds. But one thing is certain: if Vision 2030 is to succeed, these narratives will one day have to find a common language. Because no state can build a future on elites alone, or on big cities alone. The future must also belong to the provinces, to women and to young people who ask themselves every day, does this vision really belong to me? Between East and West. For years, Saudi Arabia has been balancing between two worlds: the West, which admires its billions and criticizes its lack of freedom, and the East, which sees it as an Islamic leader and a partner in regional power games. Vision 2030 and NEOM have become the place where these two narratives meet and clash. In the West, Saudi Arabia wants to be seen as a modern global player. Appearances at Davos, investments in Silicon Valley, contracts with the biggest tech firms, these are elements of that story. Slogans about sustainability, zero emissions and innovation sound familiar in London, New York, and Paris. At the same time, the West does not forget about authoritarianism, about Khashoggi, about restrictions on women. Every enthusiasm is mixed with skepticism. In the East, especially in Asia, the picture is different. For China, Saudi Arabia is a strategic partner in energy and logistics, part of the new Silk Road. For Muslim countries, a religious authority, home to the two holy mosques, a symbol of Islamic pride. Here, Vision 2030 is seen more as proof of strength than as a project to be judged morally. The criticism loudly heard in the West often barely registers in Asia or Africa. Imagine two articles published on the same day. In the New York Times, a journalist asks, "Is NEOM genuine transformation or just marketing by an authoritarian state?" In China Daily, the headline reads, "Saudi Arabia opens the doors to the future. NEOM as a model for global cooperation." These two texts differ not only in tone, they show how the world sees two different Saudi Arabias. This conflict of narratives isn't just about image, it is real politics. Saudi Arabia plays on both fronts. On one hand, buying English football clubs and partnering with American companies. On the other, signing huge contracts with China and investing in Africa. Each partner hears a different story. The West hears of modernization and innovation. The East hears of strength, stability, and leadership in the Islamic world. But speaking in two voices comes at a price. The more Saudi Arabia tries to talk in two languages, the higher the risk that both worlds start seeing not a leader, but an actor playing a role that doesn't always fit the stage. Aisha, scrolling through social media comments, tells her brother, "The world argues about us more than we argue about ourselves. The West says we're prisoners. The East says we're heroes. I just want to know who we really are." Narratives in conflict show that Saudi Arabia does not exist in a vacuum. Its future depends not only on the prince's decisions, but also on how the world chooses to interpret its story. Because no vision is complete until it is told and accepted, both inside the country and beyond its borders. And that is where this episode ends, with the question of whether Saudi Arabia will manage to merge these two narratives into one coherent story, or whether it will always live in between East and West, torn in two, never fully accepted by either side. Saudi Arabia's narratives are like mirrors set up in a vast hall. Each one reflects a different fragment. The state shows the world futuristic visions. Citizens talk about everyday struggles. The West judges morality and human rights. The East admires strength and money. But none of these mirrors shows the full picture. Only together do they form a mosaic in which we see a country torn between dream and skepticism, between pride and fear, between hope and silence. We've seen how the official narrative paints Saudi Arabia as a leader of the global future. We've seen the everyday narrative of people who, behind the billboards, still wrestle with high bills and traditional constraints. We've looked into global media, where NEOM is both a symbol of progress and an example of propaganda. We've heard the narrative of silence, absent from official brochures yet loud in glances and half-spoken jokes. And finally, we've seen how young people, women, and the provinces tell their own versions of the future, often running on parallel tracks. At the end, we reached the biggest clash, the conflict between Eastern and Western narratives. For some, Saudi Arabia is a hero of modernization. For others, a master of marketing. For some, NEOM is proof of a powerful future. For others, an empty city built on the backs of workers and on oil. The boundary of this episode is a question with no simple answers. Who is really writing Saudi Arabia's story? Is it Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his advisors? Is it ordinary citizens slowly learning to dream differently? Or is it the outside world which, through criticism or praise, decides whether Vision 2030 will be remembered as a triumph or an illusion? Here, our story hangs in the air like an echo over the desert. Because every image, every narrative is just one version of the truth. And Saudi Arabia's future depends on whether all these versions can be woven into a single, coherent story.